So please have a look at the question. The question is, explain the difference between the computing methodology of India's gross domestic product before the year 2015 and after the year 2015. This question, as you can see, it was asked for 10 marks and you are required to write the answer in approximately around 150 words. So let's first understand as to why this question was asked. First and foremost, this question is directly related to your syllabus. So in your syllabus, you have a topic of Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth and development. So from this particular topic, we had UPSC had asked this particular question. Apart from that, as you can see in the previous year mains, questions have been asked with respect to various aspects of GDP. In mains 2020, that is previous year mains, we had this question related to what do you mean by potential GDP? What are its determinants? And what are the factors which are inhibiting India from realizing its potential GDP? As far as this question, which was asked in mains 2021 is concerned, this question also has relevance as far as current affairs is concerned. Why? In the year 2015, the Central Statistical Office decided to change the GDP computation methodology based upon the recommendations of a committee known as K. Sundaram Committee. So based upon the recommendations of K. Sundaram Committee, we decided to change the GDP computation methodology. After the changes were introduced, there was huge controversy. So on one hand, some of the economists, particularly former Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Arvind Subramaniam, claimed that India may be overestimating its GDP by almost around 2.5%. So we may be inflating our GDP numbers. That was what was claimed by some of the economists. Whereas the government's point of view was that whatever changes which we had introduced as far as the GDP methodology is concerned, these changes were introduced to align the GDP computation methodology in line with the international standards known as System of National Accounts. So we have something known as System of National Accounts 2008. It is an international standard, an international benchmark, which the countries across the world use in order to estimate the GDP. This international standard has been developed by international organizations such as United Nations, World Bank, IMF, etc. So government said, look, we are not inflating the GDP numbers. What we have basically done is we have just changed our GDP methodology in line with the international standards. So changes in the GDP methodology had created this controversy. But the question is, why did this controversy arise in the first place? Why did the economists feel that we were inflating our GDP numbers? Let me give you two examples to further substantiate this point of view. In the year 2016-17, we estimated our GDP by using the new GDP computation methodology. And we got to know that in the year 2016-17, the Indian economy registered the highest GDP growth rate in the entire decade. In the entire decade, our highest GDP growth rate was in the year 2016-17. Now you must be wondering, so what? You must be able to recall that the year 2016-17 was the year of demonetization. It was in the year 2016-17 that the government announced demonetization. Because of the demonetization, there was a liquidity crunch in the economy. The liquidity crunch in turn led to decline in the economic activity. So this decline in the economic activity should have led to reduced GDP growth rate in the year 2016-17, right? But what did our GDP methodology show? Our GDP methodology showed that we registered higher GDP growth rate in the year of demonetization. Obviously, people will question this, right? Second point, if you look at the years 2004 to 2014, earlier, we estimated the GDP growth rate for these years by using the earlier methodology. So whatever methodology which we were using that methodology, we estimated our GDP numbers. As I said, in the year 2015, we changed our GDP methodology. After changing the GDP methodology in the year 2015, we tried to find out as to what was the GDP growth rate for this decade using the new methodology. So we applied the new methodology to find out the GDP growth rate for the years 2004 to 2014. But then what we got to know in this case is, using the new methodology, the GDP growth rate was actually lower than what we had estimated earlier. Using the new methodology, whatever GDP growth rate we estimated between the years 2004 to 2014, this was lower than what we had estimated earlier. Once again, you must be wondering, so what? Between the years 2004 to 2014, this was a UPA era. After the year 2014-15, who came into power? The NDA government. So some of the statisticians, some of the economists believed that government is trying to show that during the previous UPA regime, GDP growth rate was lower, and during its regime, especially when demonetization took place, the GDP growth rate was higher. Are you getting this point? So that is why economists started questioning our GDP numbers. They started saying that probably we are inflating our GDP numbers by approximately around 2.5%. So as far as the UPSC Mains examination is concerned, as you can see, they have not asked a question as to what was the controversy with respect to the GDP estimation. The question is very, very straightforward. The question is how India's GDP computation methodology has changed before and after the year 2015. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to discuss the content for the answer as to what all points you could have incorporated in your answer. After making you understand the content, then I will discuss as to how you could have structured the content in terms of introduction, body, and the conclusion. Okay, so let's look at the content to the answer. I hope all of you are able to see this, the mind map. So this is a mind map which I have prepared in order to put all the points related to the GDP estimation. As far as the background is concerned, the background part I have already discussed that in the year 2015, the Central Statistical Office decided to change the GDP computation methodology based upon the recommendations of K. Sundaram Committee. And I've also discussed that these changes were introduced because India wanted to align its GDP computation methodology in line with the international standards. That is the System of National Accounts 2008. Okay. After these changes were introduced, there was a controversy that India is overestimating its GDP numbers by approximately around 2.5%. The Economic Survey 2019-20 had a separate chapter wherein it discussed that India is not overestimating its GDP numbers. It highlighted that whatever fears, whatever apprehensions the economists have raised that we are overestimating our GDP numbers, they are completely unfounded. So let's understand as to what all changes took place in the GDP computation methodology. But if I just discuss as to what are the changes in the GDP computation methodology without discussing as to how the GDP is actually calculated, it will be meaningless. So let me discuss as to how the GDP is actually calculated. Then you will be able to have much greater correlation between the how GDP is calculated and what all changes were introduced. So let's understand the GDP computation methodology. I hope all of you are able to see the screen. All of you? Okay. See, when we calculate GDP, gross domestic product, GDP can be calculated at 3 different levels. GDP at factor cost, GDP at basic price, and GDP at market price. When we say GDP at factor cost, it basically takes into account the cost of factors of production. That is, cost of factors of production such as land, labor, capital, and so on. When we calculate GDP at basic price here means how much price is the manufacturer expected to receive when he sells the goods and services. So basic price is from the perspective of whom? From the perspective of manufacturer. How much price a manufacturer is expected to receive when he sells the goods and services. Market price is a price that the consumer is required to pay on purchasing the goods and services. Now, for example, let's say I'm an entrepreneur and I'm manufacturing this marker. Okay. To manufacture this marker, I would have to spend money on factors of production, say land, labor, capital, and so on, right? So how much money I'm spending on these factors of production, that will be my GDP at factor cost. So let's say to manufacture this marker, I'm spending 10 rupees. So what will be my GDP at factor cost? Rupees 10. When I sell this marker, I as a manufacturer, when I sell this marker, say I'm getting rupees 12. So basic price will be how much? Rupees 12. When you are purchasing this marker and let's say you are paying rupees 15. So market price will be how much? 15. So these are the changes. So let's look at this figure now. So let's say a particular industry is spending rupees 100 on these factors of production, that is land, labor, and capital. So as I can see there, factor cost is the cost of factors of production. So can I say here that my GDP at factor cost is equal to rupees 100? Are you with me on this? Yes? Okay. Now we need to calculate the basic price. What is basic price? Basic price is a price which is expected to be received by the producer of goods and services. Now to calculate the basic price, you have two concepts. Concepts of production taxes and production subsidies. The question is, what are the production taxes? Production taxes are the taxes which are paid on the factors of production. Who is paying them? It is being paid by manufacturer of goods and services. So the person who is manufacturing the goods and services, he is paying taxes on what? On these factors of production. So that we call it as production taxes. For example, for land, a particular person may be paying the stamp duty, registration tax, right? So that becomes the production tax. So production taxes are paid by the manufacturers on the factors of production. Production taxes are not paid on per unit of product. This is very important. For example, GST. Do you pay GST on factors of production? No, you pay GST on per unit of product. So production taxes are paid on the factors of production. By whom? By the manufacturer. Similar to that, you have production subsidies. These are the subsidies which the manufacturers get on the factors of production. For example, the government here may provide land at subsidized prices. The government may provide capital or loans at subsidized rates of interest. So can I say that these are the subsidies which the manufacturers are getting on the factors of production, right? So these are the production subsidies. Once again, you must understand here, production subsidies are not given on per unit of product. They are always given on what? On the factors of production. So whenever the government is subsidizing land, capital, what we call that? We will call that as production subsidies. Now, how do you calculate the basic price? Basic price is calculated as GDP at factor cost plus production taxes minus production subsidies. For example, let's say this is my GDP at factor cost, okay? And my production taxes is ₹10. I'm paying 10 rupees in the form of production taxes such as stamp duty and so on. And I am receiving, say, 5 rupees in the form of production subsidies, such as say subsidized land, capital, etc. So what will be my basic price here? Basic price will be 100 plus 10, 110 minus 5. So this GDP at basic price, it will be equal to 105. Are we clear on this? Apart from that, I just want to make one thing clear here. You must have also heard of a concept of GVA at basic price, gross value added at basic price. Please do not confuse. GDP at basic price and GVA at basic price, both are same. There's no difference between the two. GDP at basic price and GVA at basic price, both are same. So when I say here that this is a GDP at basic price, this is same as GVA at basic price as well. Are we clear now? Let's try to find out the GDP at market price. See, just like how you have production taxes and production subsidies, here you have product taxes and product subsidies. The difference here is product taxes are applicable on per unit of product. And who is paying these product taxes? They are paid by whom? By the consumers. Production taxes are applicable to the manufacturers. They are applicable on factors of production. Product taxes are paid by the consumers and they are applicable on per unit of product. Per unit of product. And the best example happens to be GST. Apart from that, you as consumers also get subsidy from the government. For example, you get food subsidy, LPG subsidy, and so on. So all of this all of these subsidies, we can consider them as product subsidies because you are getting this as a consumer and it is applicable on per unit of product. So how do you calculate the GDP at market price? GDP at market price is calculated as GDP at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies. For example, in this case, let's say my product taxes is 5 and my product subsidies is equal to 2. So 105 plus 5, 110 minus 2, this will be my GDP. Are we clear on this, all of you? So to summarize our discussion, GDP can be measured at 3 levels: GDP at factor cost, GDP at basic price, and GDP at market price. When we say factor cost, it takes into account the cost of factors of production. Basic price means how much price a producer is expected to receive on selling goods and services. Market price is how much price you are required to pay as a consumer. Okay. So now let's understand as to what changes have taken place with respect to the GDP computation methodology after the year 2015. I'll come to that. Okay. First one is with respect to the base year. Earlier, as you know, the GDP as such, it can be calculated at two levels: real GDP and nominal GDP. Real GDP, you are taking into account the base year prices. Nominal GDP, you are taking into account the current market prices. So to calculate real GDP, earlier we used to take into account the base year prices of the year 2004-5. But after the year 2015, we have started taking the base year prices of 2011-12. This is one important change. So normally, revisions are made with respect to the base year, and we did this revision in the year 2015. It's a natural process. Second one is with respect to the default GDP. Before the year 2015, whenever we used to refer to the word GDP, GDP always meant GDP at factor cost before the year 2015. But now when we say GDP, GDP means GDP at market price. So before the year 2015, whenever you used to come across in the newspapers or say the government notification about GDP, it meant GDP at factor cost, but now it means GDP at market price. Third one is with respect to how the GDP is actually calculated, GDP computation. First one is, see, when we are measuring GDP, we are required to calculate the economic activity in the different sectors like agriculture, industry, services, and so on. So what we do is, in order to measure the economic activity in each of these sectors, agriculture, industry, and services, we calculate the economic activity through GDP at basic prices or the GVA at basic prices. So remember the last slide I told you, GDP at factor cost and GDP at basic price. So to calculate the contribution of different sectors to the India's economy, what we take is the GDP at the basic price. And then to calculate the GDP at an all India level, what we do is we sum up the GDP at basic price or the GVA at basic price of agriculture, industry, and services. To that we add product taxes and deduct the product subsidies. So that is how we are now calculating the GDP at market price. Next change is with respect to the change in the database. See, when we measure GDP, we are required to take into account the production of goods and services in the economy. But where do we capture this production? Where do you capture this economic activity? Earlier, we used to capture this economic activity through the annual survey of industries. But now this economic activity, we are now capturing through the MCA 21 database, which is maintained by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So the MCA 21 database is now used to capture the economic activity for the GDP estimation. Next, we have improved the coverage of financial corporations such as insurance companies, pension fund companies, mutual fund companies. So even the contribution of these companies we are taking into account based upon the information provided by the respective regulators such as SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA, and so on. And last and most important is inclusion of R&D expenditure as part of the gross capital formation, that is GCF. I hope most of you must be knowing that when we measure GDP through the expenditure method, we take into account 4 parameters, right? Private final consumption expenditure, gross capital formation, then government final consumption expenditure, and net exports. So now the money that we are spending on research and development, we are including it under gross capital formation, GCF. Are we clear now with respect to the changes? MCA 21 database is basically a database which is maintained by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So in this particular database, you have the list of all the companies which are registered in India. Apart from that, this database also provides us with the details of the economic activity or the production of goods and services in these companies. Okay. Okay, fine. Now coming to the controversy. What was the controversy with respect to the GDP estimation? Why did some of the economists think that India is inflating its GDP numbers? The first concern is with respect to change in the default GDP. As I said, before the year 2015, whenever we used to refer to GDP, GDP meant GDP at factor cost. But now, after the year 2015, when we say GDP, GDP is GDP at market price. Now, can I say here that GDP at market price, in most of the cases, it is higher than the GDP at factor cost, right? In most of the cases, the GDP at market price is higher than the GDP at factor cost, right? Now, the problem is, after the year 2015, immediately we changed the GDP computation methodology. After the year 2015, we started referring to GDP as GDP at market price. So suddenly there was an increase in the GDP numbers. But question is, was there an increase in production of goods and services? No, there was no increase in production of goods and services. Only thing is that the name GDP, earlier it was factor cost and now it is GDP at market price. Apart from that, how do you calculate the GDP at market price? GDP at market price is GDP at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies. Now, just have a look at this. If the product taxes increase and product subsidies decrease, can I say my GDP at market price will increase? So just by increasing the product taxes, and reducing the product subsidies, the GDP at market price could increase. So this is what was highlighted by some of the economists. But once again, question is, are these arguments fair enough? Now, you must understand, to be fair enough to the government has said that when we change the GDP computation methodology, we have not changed it at our own discretion. We have changed it in line with the international standards, that is system of national accounts. Countries across the world, when they say GDP, they mean GDP at market price. So what we have done is we have just adopted the international standards. So this argument, I don't think it stands as far as this point is concerned. Second point is with respect to the MCA 21 database. Now, this is quite interesting also. As I said earlier, in order to capture the economic activity in India, in order to measure the production of goods and services, we used to rely on annual survey of industries. But now we are relying on the MCA 21 database. Some of the economists have highlighted that there are flaws, there are problems in the MCA 21 database. For example, according to some of the economists, almost around 38% of the firms in the MCA 21 database are actually the shell firms. Now, what are shell firms? The shell firms are the companies which exist only on paper. These companies have been created only to convert black money into white money. They are not involved in production of goods and services. But if you look at the balance sheet of these companies, right? If you look at the balance sheets, in the balance sheets, you'll come to know that these companies have produced goods and services, but in reality, they're not produced anything. They are actually showing fake accounts in order to convert black money into white money. Best example could be with respect to the fake GST invoices. You must have heard, right, that a large number of companies have been set up in order to create just fake invoices, just for the input, just for claiming input tax credit. In reality, they're not involved in production of goods and services. So same here, in the MCA 21 database, we have almost around 38% of companies which are shell companies, which are actually not producing any goods and services, but they, on their balance sheet, they are showing economic transactions. Now just imagine, if you take those companies into account, if you take those production of goods and services of these companies into account for the calculation of GDP, don't you think our GDP numbers will be inflated? Right? So this was a valid concern raised by some of the economists. that there are a number of shell firms in the MCA 21 database. And lastly, if you see the case of Indian economy, the sectors can be broadly categorized as formal sector and informal sector. The formal sector maintains accounts, whereas the informal sector is widely scattered. The informal sector normally do not maintain accounts. The best example happens to be the small scale industries, MSMEs. So if you want to measure economic activity or the production of goods and services in the formal sector, it is very, very easy because you can simply have a look at their accounts. But is it possible to directly measure the economic activity in the informal sector? Not possible, because they don't maintain any accounts. So what we do is, while computing the GDP, we measure the economic activity in the formal sector as to how much of goods, how much of services the formal sector has produced. And then whatever data that we get from the formal sector, that same data we then extrapolate to the informal sector. When I say informal, extrapolate means we make inferences. For example, let's say we assume, now for example, we have calculated that the formal sector has grown by 8%. Then we make inferences that the informal sector could have also grown by certain percentage. Now, how these inferences are made, on what basis the inferences are made, not really important from the perspective of the examination. But what you need to know is, directly we don't measure the economic activity in the informal sector. We extrapolate the growth of the informal sector based upon the growth of the formal sector. Now, this had created a problem in the year 2016-17. Year of demonetization, remember, liquidity crunch, but which sector got more affected? Formal sector. The informal sector. The formal sector was able to come out of the problem of demonetization. But when we estimated our GDP numbers, we got to know that the formal sector has registered good growth. So we extrapolated the same data to find out the growth of the informal sector, and then we said that GDP has grown higher. So these are some important things as far as what could have been incorporated in your answers. That is the background, the changes, and the controversy. So let's discuss the suggested answer to this particular question. Now look at the question. The question is very, very straightforward. The question is, you have to explain the changes in the GDP computation methodology before and after the year 2015. So the suggested answer here would be, in your introduction, you could directly start with a rationale behind the changes in the GDP computation. See, some of the students may feel that a good introduction here could be starting with a definition of what is GDP. Some students may feel that. But let me tell you, this question is asked for 10 marks. You don't have much scope. Definitions would have to be written where, the examiner may feel that the concept is a little difficult. Only then you have to explain the definition. For a straightforward topic such as, say, GDP, I don't think you have to explain the definition in the introduction. Your introduction should directly hit the nail on the head and start off with the rationale behind the changes in the GDP computation. Clear? So here, you could incorporate the fact that in the introduction, you could write, in the year 2015, Central Statistical Office changed the GDP computation methodology on the recommendations of K. Sundaram Committee. This was done to bring India's GDP computation methodology in line with the international standards of System of National Accounts 2008. That's it. Your introduction should be very short, very precise, to the point. Your introduction should not exceed more than 10% of the word limit prescribed for the answer. So here, the answer has to be written in how much? 150 words. So your introduction should not exceed 10 to 15% of the word limit. So you must write the answer maximum between 15 to 20 words, not more than that. Then in the body of the answer, start off directly with respect to the important changes after the year 2015. Explain the changes. Once again, while explaining the changes, incorporate these changes in the form of bullet points. That's more good here, because when you explain the bullet points, you will be able to write the answer within the stipulated word limit. After discussing the changes, very briefly touch upon how these recent changes have created controversy. Don't explain that in detail, because that is not the requirement of the question. Just touch upon these changes as to what controversy it has created. For example, you can just write that after these changes, some of the economists have highlighted that GDP numbers are inflated by 2.5%. However, it has been argued by the economic survey that these fears are unfounded. That's it. One statement alone will be more than sufficient. And then the way forward. Now, what can be the way forward as far as this answer is concerned? See, the credibility of Indian economy in turn depends upon our ability to come out with error-free, foolproof, and indisputable GDP estimates. We must come out with GDP estimates which are indisputable. No one should question our GDP numbers. Question is here, are we China? Are we China? You must have repeatedly come across in newspapers that most of the economists, international economists, they don't believe in the GDP numbers of China. They do believe that China is inflating the GDP numbers. Are we China? We are not China, right? We are a much more credible and trustworthy economy. No one should question our GDP numbers. So what should be the way forward as far as this question is concerned? See, after this controversy erupted that India is inflating the GDP numbers, the government then appointed a committee known as the Pranab-Sen Committee. The Pranab-Sen Committee has been asked to look into the entire gamut of issues related to the statistical system in India, including whether India is overestimating its GDP numbers, including whether there are any flaws in the GDP estimation methodology. So far, Pranab-Sen Committee has not submitted its recommendations. But as and when Pranab-Sen Committee submits its recommendations should be taken into account so that we are able to come out with the credible GDP estimates, indisputable GDP estimates. No one should question our GDP estimates. So this could have been your conclusion. So let's look at the model answer to this question. So can you see here in the introduction? So we have briefly touched upon the rationale behind the changes in the GDP computation methodology, wherein we have highlighted that changes were introduced based upon the recommendations of K. Sundaram Committee to bring it in line with the system of national accounts. Then in the body, directly start with the important changes in the form of bullet points, and then briefly touch upon the fact about the recent controversy with respect to the GDP estimates, and look at the conclusion. The conclusion says the credibility of economy depends upon the ability to come out with the foolproof and indisputable GDP estimates. Hence, recommendations of Pranab-Sen Committee should be taken into consideration in future. Are we clear now, all of you? Yes? Rohan, I'll come to your doubt later, okay? At the end of the class. Are we clear, all of you? Yes? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Okay, as far as from where you could have answered the question, this was incorporated in your prelims, in our prelims compass, page number 6. As you can see in your prelims compass, page number 6, you have this changes in the GDP estimation after the year 2015. So that is directly the body of your answer.